We're going to be talking about the Climate Leadership Plan and its application to the Alberta oil and gas industry. So maybe what we'll do just to get started, could you give us an overview of the Climate Leadership Plan and how it'll affect Alberta oil and gas, and in particular the oil sands?
Sure. Well, the Climate Leadership Plan is much, much more than oil and gas, but Alberta, of course, has a very, it makes a large economic contribution to the province. And so what the Climate Plan really tries to do is address our emissions in a number of different ways. So first of all, it's an economy-wide price on carbon, phased in at $20 per ton here in January. It started January 1st. Along with that economy-wide price on carbon, we've done a number of things to recycle those revenues. They are circumscribed in law. We can't use them for general revenue. We can't use them for purposes other than what was outlined in law, which is things like cutting taxes, greenhouse gas mitigation, investments in clean tech, and so on. So in January, rebates to low and middle income Albertans moved out as part of the Climate Leadership Plan, and small business taxes were cut by a third. Another piece of it is, of course, the phasing out of coal-fired electricity by 2030. Alberta had 6 coal-fired electricity plants that were scheduled to run past 2030 all the way into 2062. So our plan phases them out by 2030, provides compensation for a return of capital to the 3 incumbent generators who had those facilities running past 2030. And those funds will be paid for out of the price on pollution that is paid by our industrial emitters. So that's another piece of it. Along with the coal-fired phase-out, we're phasing in 30% of our electricity generated by renewables. And that's generation, not capacity. So of course the balance would be made up by natural gas and probably a little bit of hydro if that becomes a bit more economic. And so there's been a number of things that we've had to do to improve the way our electricity system functions, and moving it away from an energy-only market to an energy and capacity regulated market. And then other than that, we have the methane reduction strategy. We have a system of output-based allocations for our large final emitters, which I can get to a little bit more details on that. And there's an on-site processing exemption that is married with the phase-in or phase-out, or I guess, of the methane voluntary compliance. So that's a piece that has an effect on the oil and gas industry as well.
Okay. One thing I'd like to ask you is, how do you respond to the criticisms that the Climate Leadership Plan will, in fact, affect the competitiveness of the Alberta oil and gas industry vis-a-vis its American competitors, who are now under President Donald Trump? A lot of that regulation is going to be rolled back. How do you respond to that?
Well, Alberta and Canada have always had a different business environment than the United States. We have socialized Medicare. So, the province pays Medicare bills. The employers don't in the same way that they do in the United States. That's a competitive advantage for Americans, or for American companies doing business in Canada. We do a number of things differently than we see in the United States. We do things differently on public education, childcare, maternity leave, you name it. We have a different value system that prevails up here. And so, as regards the competitiveness with the United States, that's one of the ways we are addressing that is through that system of output-based allocations for our large final emitters, and ensuring that the methane policies are phased in a way that provides a voluntary compliance period, so people will get offset credit for their investments, and that regulatory backstop being some years hence. That's also why we, even prior to any changes at the level of the federal administration, we ensured that there was an on-ramp for Alberta oil and gas through the on-site processing exemption. That was something that we worked out with industry. I think it's really important to note 2 things. This Climate Leadership Plan was developed in collaboration and in partnership with our oil and gas industry. And second, we are seeing, due to price and other fundamentals falling into place, a large amount of new investment announcemements coming from the oil and gas sector. And so I think the larger challenge for Alberta's oil and gas sector, quite frankly, is going to come from any actions that come on the border with respect to border taxes and so on. And the ongoing challenge that we've tried to address through our modernized royalty framework as well, which is the high costs. Alberta has historically been a high cost producer, and what we've tried to do through the modernized royalty framework is ensure that we are incenting those lower cost producers. And carbon is an input cost, and so this is part of that.
You mentioned that you developed the climate leadership plan in consultation with the oil and gas industry. Now, I noticed that the big producers represented by, say, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers seemed to be on side. They were on the stage with President Notley when she made the announcement back in 2015. But the small producers, the medium-sized producers, don't seem to be quite as on board. They seem to be far more critical. They're worried about competitiveness. Does the climate leadership plan affect small producers differently than it affects large producers?
Well, the on-site processing exemption means that there are a number of unpriced carbon emissions within the economy, and that goes largely to the small and medium producers. And whereas the large producers or large final emitters have been in a carbon pricing situation since 2008 in Alberta. And so I think what we will see over time is the economic benefits that come to some of these small and medium-sized producers with respect to the innovations in methane abatement. There's lots of interesting opportunities there for clean tech entrepreneurs. And we're also seeing the benefits of the modernized royalty framework. We're seeing a number of new drilling rigs and so on as a result of that framework, and now as a result of price turnaround and some of those other pieces falling into place. We're seeing billions of dollars of new investment coming back, or at least planned for 2017. And so, I think we are through some of the worst of it. What we've tried to do here with the climate leadership plan is provide certainty and provide a roadmap that allows us to achieve those pipeline approvals, which, the Prime Minister was very clear that the Kinder Morgan proposal and the Enbridge proposal came about as a result of the climate leadership plan and its breadth in terms of how it addresses our environmental challenges here in Alberta.
Now, you mentioned that some of the methane reduction, for instance, that would benefit small and junior producers, and I didn't quite understand how will that affect them or benefit them more than it would the large producers?
Well, I don't know if it's an either or, but I do think it is an opportunity that firms who invest earlier in that methane reduction in technology and so on, they will get offset credit for that. And those are an economic instrument that can be used for other endeavors and other investments. Because we are moving towards a system where by sometime in the mid-2020s, that voluntary piece will sunset and the regulatory piece will come into play. The earlier that firms make those investments, the longer they get that credit for. And that is an economic opportunity for those who are producing in that space.
Okay. I have another question about the methane emissions, Minister. I noticed on your website that it said the oil sands were responsible for 25% of Alberta's greenhouse gas emissions, but then I also noticed that the methane emissions were also in CO2 equivalents responsible for 25% of Alberta's greenhouse gas emissions, which seems to me to be, the oil sands gets all the attention, the methane emissions get very little attention. Would it make, and your reduction target is 40% over, I forget what the date is, but it's 40%. Would it not make more sense to enter into a partnership with industry to get the methane emission target up to maybe 75 or 80%, and that give you a little bit of leeway on oil sands producers or in other areas? What do you think of that?
Well, the methane policy through the Leach, Andrew Leach, of course, led this. Dr. Andrew Leach from the School of Business led the process, and the methane piece was developed with industry as well, and 45% reduction by 2020. Three, I believe, off of 2014 levels was what they felt was achievable, and they came to us with that target. And it was actually in the early days a more ambitious target than we had initially thought was possible. And so, I think what we need to get clear here is some of the pieces around measuring, reporting, verification. There's a lot of work to do around that. There's a lot of work to do around, the offset protocol has been posted, but how we get there and when the regulatory backstop comes in and the role of the federal government and so on is subject to ongoing negotiations. So these things take a little bit of time. And I think that where we wanted to move on this was to set something that was achievable, that was ambitious, and this absolutely is. And then we can actually revisit it over time as well as technology improves and so on. The federal government has adopted that target as a result of Alberta leading on this matter. And then the previous White House also adopted it as a target, and then Mexico also adopted it. And so it became sort of a continental initiative, which is something that we were really proud of, because instead of seeing competitiveness as a race to the bottom, competitiveness then became a race to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is exactly where we wanted. That's exactly the role I think that Alberta should play as an energy producer, and seeing those opportunities in ways to put people back to work, and to address problems in the energy space using the technology that we have right now and ways that we know that we can improve on it.
Now, one of the things so we talked about the previous White House, and of course you're referring to the Obama administration, and now we have the Trump administration, which has a completely different point of view on this whole issue. So I guess we're still waiting to see how that's going to pan out. In your opinion, does the climate leadership plan help to get Alberta access to Asian markets, say once Trans Mountain expansion is complete at the Tidewater and Alberta oil is headed over to Asia, or will it make no difference at all?
Well, when the Prime Minister and Cabinet approved the Kinder Morgan and the Enbridge lines, they were very clear that they were only able to do so because Alberta had taken substantive action on the question of greenhouse gas emissions. And, Canadian markets or access through a Canadian pipeline to Tidewater remains our priority as a government, because this is about diversifying our markets and ensuring that we can get world price for our heavy oil resources. And so, there are different kinds of conversations that we have to have with our neighboring provinces and with the Canadian public that then might be had south of the border. I mean, there are still questions around greenhouse gas emissions, upstream environmental effects, and so on, even in the United States. But these questions are quite acute in Canada, and they must be addressed head on, and that's what our government has done. And we saw the results of that through the approval at the federal cabinet level for the Trans Mountain expansion.
Now, okay, so you say that they have to be addressed, and I noticed on your website it talked a lot about technology being the mechanism to eventually get greenhouse gas emissions down. And being a technology journalist, of course, I'm very interested in that. Now, one of the things we've seen is companies like Cenovus, they talk about substituting diluent for steam, so we don't have to use natural gas to heat up the steam. And secondly, we see mining companies like Imperial Oil at their Curl plant that have new technologies that dramatically lower greenhouse gas emissions in the well-to-wheels basis. So there we have two examples. Are those the kind of technologies, and what's the government going to do to work with industry to diffuse those technologies to other companies so the industry as a whole can make progress on this area?
Well, I think there's two things here. There's the first piece is the push, if you will. As we set those output-based allocations, I think the goal has to be for our oil sands producers, and these are conversations we've had in successive technical engagements with them on this matter, is I think the goal has to be clean as conventional extraction, and they share that too. And so when we set an output-based allocation, what we're setting is basically a performance standard. And if you are exceeding that standard, then of course you'll get credit. But there's then a push to reduce one's GHGs to that standard, and that standard will change over time. And so that's part of the piece, and that's part of how we kind of wrote this policy. On the other side, we have made commitments to be reinvesting both some carbon levy funds of the economy-wide price and some of the proceeds from the carbon competitiveness regulation, the sort of price on pollution that the large final emitters pay, in order to assist with some of these investments in technology. We've already seen, we've moved some of them out with the methane piece, $40 million moved out through our emissions reduction agency, which is essentially our clean tech fund. And we're looking at ways that we can add to those efforts, either through partnering with COSIA, which is the Canadian Oil Sands Industry Alliance, or through other mechanisms through carbon commercialization and so on. So there are a number of different ways that we are addressing this. We'll have a little bit more clarity through the budget time this spring on how we're going to make those investments. We've had a climate and GHG technology task force out there gathering input. It was chaired by a former VP of Suncor, Gord Lambert. And so he's brought us back some very thoughtful and substantive ideas on how to move forward on this. I think it's fair to say that both of these things are a partnership, and you know, oil sands industry in particular recognizes that the status quo is not an option. Having said that, this is all of our problem, and so those reinvestments and how we're going to be thoughtful on that is the government's responsibility.
Now, I noticed that you're very careful to make sure that you talk about the partnership with industry, and I appreciate that. And what areas is industry pushing back on? Areas where there's maybe the technology doesn't exist, or they think the regulations are too onerous. There has to be some areas where you're not in sync, totally in sync.
Well, you know, the conversations around where the performance standard is set for those essentially free allocation of CO2 are ongoing, and they're ongoing through 2017. We gave ourselves quite a bit longer runway on that issue because we knew that they would be highly technical conversations, and we gave ourselves a little bit more runway too on the support for clean technology and how we might be thoughtful about our investments there as a government, because it's not just about the carbon levy and the reinvestment of the price on pollution. It's also about how we use our investments through the Sovereign Wealth Fund, through the Heritage Fund, through our various Alberta Innovates. You know, the government of Alberta has a number of different vehicles through which it makes these investments, and that has to be a very thoughtful approach that takes into account the whole fiscal picture. And we wanted to make sure that we had the right advice and that we're working those details through in the most thoughtful way we could.
So if I understand this correctly, if there's any friction in industry and government, it's around setting standards and timelines?
You know, I think most of the timelines are set. There's certainly some standards to be haggled out. There's no question about that. We found that though that we working together, we get somewhere faster than if we're working at loggerheads. We're really trying to be collaborative in this and solutions based. You know, there's no end of problems to solve, but you know, both parties have to roll up their sleeves and solve them. That's why we are sitting around a table with the oil sands through the Oil Sands Advisory Group. We've even got environmental organizations sitting there, and Indigenous communities, and representatives of northern counties and in northern Alberta and municipalities. Because you know, it all goes together, right? The land use decisions, the air, land, and water monitoring pieces, the role of the GOA, the government of Alberta in that, and the role of how development affects communities.
One of the things I'd like to know is how effective, or in your opinion, is the Oil Sands Advisory Committee? Because of course, Zipporah Berman in particular has been a bit of a lightning rod. She, on the one hand, is giving you, and I understand that her advice is only for how to reduce emissions from the oil sands. The government has made that very clear, and I wrote a column about it. But is the committee providing valuable advice, and is the government acting upon it?
Well, right now, what is concerning the committee is the development of the regulations around the 100 megaton limit in the oil sands. That's not something I talked about earlier in terms of one of the pillars of the climate leadership plan, but it is very much an important piece. We've been the first energy producing jurisdiction to establish a limit on emissions from an energy sector, and so we passed a bill to that effect in the fall. So it is a legislated limit. Now we have to put the regulations around it in terms of how the approvals process works around that, for example, and so on, and the role of incumbents and so on. Now, the Oil Sands Advisory Group is an extension of the group of people who brought us that advice to bring forward the oil sands emission limit in the first place. And there were certainly voices on that group that have views that I don't share on the role of pipeline access, for example. And, we've been very clear that, we disagree on a number of things, but where we don't disagree is that the oil sands make a valuable contribution to the province and to the country, and we need to be able to have those substantive conversations with its critics, our critics outside of the province's borders, and I think that's where the value comes in. I've also been very clear that membership will change over time. Because there were so many oil companies and others and local community-based organizations, that is to say municipalities, indigenous organizations, and others that wanted to participate on the Oil Sands Advisory Group. So I fully anticipate that organically the membership will turn over time once we have completed its first phase of work, which is around the oil sands limit. The next piece of work will come around some of the clean tech pieces that we were talking about. We're looking for some advice around that as well.
Let's talk for a minute about the 100 megaton limit. The oil sands is now at 70 megatons. How is that 30 megaton going to be allocated? I know there's been some confusion in the industry about that. What can you tell us about it?
Well, that's exactly the topic of conversation right now that will be worked out in the regulations. I think obviously there is a big role for technology there in terms of existing operations. And then there's a big role for the Alberta Energy Regulator in terms of allocating which plays or in the approvals process, and they are at the table as well. I think that what you'll end up seeing though over time is just like in the modernized royalty framework, where what we're trying to do, the push is towards lower costs of extraction, right, and lowering the costs overall, whether it's on the labor side or the exploration and production side, etc. Carbon is an input cost, and so what you're trying to do is ensure that you have regulations that will push towards those lower cost areas where carbon is priced, and that that's been one of the things that the industry has said that they want to see. They are fully engaged in this process, have come to us with some really good solutions around that. And I'll note that those ideas in the first place came to us from a group of oil sands officials, vice presidents and others, who sat down with environmental groups to say, okay, how can we move from saying no to each other on everything to a position where we say yes if. And that's where we have moved the conversation, and you have seen a real turning down of the noise and the opposition and the rhetoric around Alberta's oil and gas development, and that's come as a direct result of having some of those difficult conversations with people who hitherto did not agree with one another.
So my takeaway from this part of the conversation is that the committee is working on recommendations for guidelines around the regulations, and basically we'll see what's the timeline when those regulations should be available for public comment.
I think that we're looking for the first half of 2017.
Okay.
So in the coming weeks, yeah.
Got you. And what about, I have one final question because I know you have to go. And I'm sorry, I apologize to our attendees. I wanted to open it up for questions, but there's been so much ground to cover that I'm afraid we've kind of run out of time. But I want to ask this question. There was a report came out about a month ago from the University of Calgary about partial upgrading of bitumen. And we did a webinar with Kent Fellows, who's the lead author on that. And one of the things he said really caught my attention was that partial upgrading lowers GH or carbon intensity by 17% on a well-to-wheels basis. So is that something that the government's going to be looking at very closely when it brings in its economic diversification strategy?
Absolutely. It is certainly something that we are very keenly aware of, and we've all had, by we've all, I mean the Minister of Energy, the Premier's Economic Advisory Council, and the Minister of Economic Development and Trade through his petroleum diversification efforts and Economic Diversification Committee. Those innovations, if you will, those technologies have all been examined by those groups, and you know, I think that we've really benefited from a lot of that existing work that has already gone into it, and that is something that the Oil Sands Advisory Group, I know, is going to be talking to us about, and potentially working with COSIA on that matter.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Phillips. We really appreciate you coming out today, and we look forward to doing this again in the coming months. We'll follow up on some of these issues, and thank you very much, and good. Have a nice day.
I really appreciate the time, and give us a call anytime. This is great. Thank you.
Okay, take care.